I mean, I would have been able to theologically tell you why God was not doing anything wrong to us, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel that way.
Welcome to With You Podcast,
where we explore relationships and life transitions. I'm Tara.
And I'm David, and this is our last episode on adoption, and we're excited to have Dr. Russell Moore here speaking with us today.
Right. We are really interested to hear about his own personal experience with adoption and his thoughts on adoption from a faith perspective. And he's written a book called Adopted for Life. We'd love for you to check out, so we can't wait to hear what he's got to say.
Let's get started. Well, we're so excited today to have Dr. Russell Moore visit with us and talk about adoption, his own experience, theology of adoption. And we'd just like to welcome you today, Dr. Moore.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to kind of dig into the theology of adoption and your experience. But I wonder, before we start, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, with my wife, and we have 5 sons, 3 of whom are at home and 2 that are out in the world. And I'm editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, originally from Biloxi, Mississippi.
All right.
That's about it.
And we found you through a mutual colleague. He said you have to read Adopted for Life and then talk to Russell, because we were looking for people to talk about kind of the theology of adoption. We've been doing about this is our 4th episode of Adoption Focus. We've had a couple of people just share their stories, and then one person talked about kind of the family systems perspective, the kind of research on impact that it has on family, specifically siblings. And so we're looking forward to talking with you about your experience and then the theology of adoption, because I think that's cornerstone to what we've heard in the last 3 weeks.
Right.
Sounds
and
good.
we did find your book, and we've gleaned some great stuff that we've learned about you, but we know that every story about adoption usually comes with some personal experience. So we'd love for you to just kind of start telling us your origin story. I know that you have some children that are welcomed through adoption, and so we'd love to kind of hear how that journey started for you and your wife, how you came to that decision, and tell us a little bit more about your personal story with adoption.
Well, our oldest 2 sons came into the family through adoption. They're 22 now, about to turn 23. And they were a year old when we adopted them. And it came through a long process of infertility, miscarriages, and so forth, that led to a long period of just sort of asking what the Lord would have of us. And my wife went to an event that was put on at a church, not our church, but a church near us. We were living in Louisville, Kentucky at the time, and was able then to meet with some folks who were working in the area of adoption. They were at the time working primarily in Russia, so that's where we ended up. We ended up adopting. So our sons were, just over a year old at the time, and we at the time had to take 2 trips, one of them 3.5 weeks long, and separated by several months. So we did that and brought our sons Ben and Timothy home. So at the time, we did not know anybody really who had adopted. So it was an entirely pioneer sort of move.
You were forging new ground.
We were forging new ground, yeah. And so we didn't. It's one of those things where you look back and you realize we one of the things that's helpful about having people who've been through a similar experience is knowing when to panic and when not to.
Yeah.
And so there were so many things that would just happen in the process that would seem like, oh, well, this is all now fallen apart.
Mm.
And we really needed people to be able to, nah, that's just bureaucracy, or that's just
Yeah.
how things happen. So,
Yeah, but I remember you writing about the process of being there and visiting the boys and then having to leave, and just the difficulty of that process, whether that's a normal process or not, how hard it must have been, to have to kind of walk away and then come back later, that kind of connection you had started to form with them.
yeah, it's Russia is not a very functional state when it comes to bureaucracy, even at the best of times. And that was not the case then either. There really was not much of a reason that I can discern to set up the system that way.
Yeah.
But they did. And yeah, it was very difficult to the first trip. We were only there for a little over a week and would go to the orphanage once a day and be able to spend time with them, and then to leave. And part of what's so difficult is when you have a child who's a year old, developmentally younger than that, there's no way to communicate. We're coming
Right.
back. We'll see you in a few months. So that was part of the difficulty of it.
Yeah.
Yes. And then when you brought them home, did you and your wife fly home with them, just the two of you and the two boys, or did you have any help?
Well, we had help in the sense that my mother-in-law went with us, but Um, although we had been told not to drink the water, and we had been very diligent not to brush teeth or whatever,
Oh no.
right before we came home, we went to a McDonald's that
Oh,
seemed, I mean, I think it gave us that sense of familiarity that we
Uh-huh.
kind of dropped our guard.
it was the
And
ice, wasn't it?
it was the ice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
So she was sick and really wasn't able to do
Oh
anything on the
no.
plane. And one of our sons screamed the entire
Oh.
way
Oh,
across
buddy.
the Atlantic Ocean, and I kept saying, sooner or later, human biology will kick in. Nobody can scream for 10 hours. I was wrong.
He's
Uh,
a strong young man.
he was a strong young man. So now, whenever I'm on a plane and there's a child crying, I have absolutely no grounds to even grumble to myself, and I
No.
That's
have
right.
learned.
Just pure sympathy, right? Pure
Yeah.
sympathy for the people going through that. I was trying to picture that because I have two adopted siblings in my own family, and that was back in the 70s. And they, at that time, they were adopted from Vietnam, and my parents weren't able to visit them first, so they were brought over on the plane by a soldier who brought
Oh, wow.
these twins who were 15 months old himself. And I just always wondered what that looked like,
Yeah.
and how that went. I think people pitched in and helped. So once you got home, how was that different? I don't think people talk much about when you welcome a child into your family. There's a lot of rituals and things set up for family um, welcoming a child through, when they give birth, you have showers and you have people
Mhm.
that come help and bring you meals. Did you have community support that welcomed your new sons in that same way?
Yes.
Great.
Of all of the difficulties that came along, that was not one of them for us. We had very strong community at every step of the process.
Mm.
So there were people who, I mean, this was before Kickstarter was a thing, but who
Mm.
essentially did a Kickstarter account to help us with all of the expenses as we went through. We had people who were giving baby showers. We had as soon as we came home, well, the entire front yard of our home was filled with people, even though it was 3 o'clock in the morning. We came home and they had scheduled meals and everything exactly the same way that someone would if child had
Yeah,
been by birth.
that's wonderful. And not everybody has that kind of community support. So what a great welcome you guys had.
Yeah.
In thinking about kind of people that have gone before, wanting to kind of back up a little bit. You talked about the fertility issues.
Hmm.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit, because people listening might be in that position. And you beautifully talked about sadness versus bitterness, and this idea of holding two things, holding the grief of expectation and loss with the joy, blessing, hope that comes with adoption. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of pre-adoption phase, what was going on for you and Maria, and how you navigated kind of the anticipated loss, or the loss, and being able to mourn and lament and not fall into that bitterness side.
Well, I'm not sure I did avoid falling into the bitterness side.
Mm,
I think Maria did, and I'm not sure that I did. And certainly I was on my way there, because it was not something that I had ever really considered. There was almost, not a spelled out, but a kind of subcognitive sense of expectations about all of the, turnings of life.
yeah.
And the next thing is the birth of children,
Hmm.
and um, that did not come easily the way that other things had. I mean, my wife and we're the only ones that each of us have seriously dated. We met very young, married very young, um, and life just kind of, each of those expected rites of passage
Hmm.
happened.
Yeah.
And then that was one that hit us. I mean, now, obviously, we did have biologically children later on, three of them
Yeah.
later on, but at the time it didn't seem like that would happen. And I think we experienced it in different ways. She experienced it more in a sense of personal failure,
Mm,
is I think the way she would describe it.
yeah.
And again, it's not a rational cognitive. It's not as though she is thinking this is a failure. It's a much more the visceral kind of
Yes.
level, and she couldn't talk her way through that. My sense was a sense of an a disappointment with God that also was not rationally ordered.
Hmm.
I mean, I
Hmm.
would have been able to theologically tell you why that was not. Um, God was not doing anything wrong to us,
Right.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
Right.
I had to work through that. Now, what I learned since then is that if it had not been for the experiences that we went through, I think I would have been a terrible father,
Mm,
because um, I would have seen children as just the next expected thing. And
Hmm.
it's not to say that I wouldn't have loved my children, but I don't think I would have seen them from start to finish with the same kind of uh, gift uh, aspect as I later did. And I think I also would have probably had more of an expectation of my children to be uh, like me
Hmm.
hmm
in some way, in a way that I think the entire experience, the infertility, the miscarriage, and the adoption process, and the early years of raising children who came into the family by adoption, that really uh, went away for a number of reasons. I mean, one of them being that what was revealed to me in the process was why I was so reluctant to adopt. So it wasn't just that we kind of had to work through in terms of wisdom and prudence, and is this something we should do? That's a hard enough uh, discernment process for
Yeah.
somebody. But I noticed that um, there were hesitations about adoption that really didn't have to do with adoption per se. So it was more than just, should we adopt, or should we adopt right now, or should we adopt in this way? There was a there was more fundamentally some ways that I was viewing family and
Mm,
children and life expectations that I had to work through.
wow.
And that didn't just apply to the first two sons. It also applied to those who came along the more typical way.
Yeah,
Uh,
it got real
because I think,
personal.
yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who think, because one of the things that I noticed was that there was quite a bit of unspoken risk management,
Mm-hmm.
which to some degree is, I think, perfectly good and,
Hmm.
and actually ought to take place, but not the way I was doing it, because I was I had a category of adopting children as risky and birthing children as not risky.
Hmm. Yeah.
And one of the things that again, I probably would have rationally known this, but I didn't viscerally know this. A a child is not just the inputs of this much DNA from dad, this much DNA from mom, plus this environment.
Yeah.
Right.
Every child is remarkably different,
Yes.
and there are certain things. My wife and I talk about this all the time, as recently as last night. They are all more or less who they showed up as,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that if you had said to me, when each of them was a baby, here, I'm going to give you a description of these five young men, and you tell me who's who. I would have scored 100 on that,
Wow. That's
because of the just the complete differences in temperament.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that it's kind of hard to actually know until you
You're
experience it.
right. It's such an interesting lesson. I don't know if I told you that I'm by trade a birth doula. So I,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
I'm with people when they meet this child, when they're preparing for their child, and it's something we all learn. I tell everybody, welcome to parenthood. Your first lesson is you are no longer in control,
That's right.
no matter how
That's
it
right.
happens. And I think everybody, no matter their path to parenthood, has their own challenge, some big thing they have to face about themselves, about learning really how little control we have and trust and all of that. And it's really interesting that you faced that in your journey to parenting before you met your first children.
Yeah, I get upset because I thought the parenting books gave us a one way of doing things,
Yeah,
and then the second child comes, and you're like, well, that was a lie, because what
that's right.
worked, we got trained by the first child, and then the second child comes, and there none of it works, and we have to be trained up another way.
Well, that's right. And I think actually one of the things that helped me the most when it came to parenting was being a preacher, Bible teacher, because I had to learn really early on. I'm talking to people in the same congregation. Some of them are coming in with a kind of presumption. Well, I mean, of course, God is going to forgive me and bear with whatever I do.
Yeah.
And another group of people who are coming in with this sense of shame. There's no way that God would ever accept somebody who's done the things that I've done. And you've got to talk to both of those groups of people
Whew.
at the same time without pushing the one. And so I would learn. I have, for instance, one of my sons who is very hard on himself, and everything is completely right or completely wrong, and he needs to excel at all those things. And with him, I have to constantly come in and say, "You're too hard on yourself. This is just you're going to make mistakes." And I have another son who is just really forgiving and non-dramatic in his relationships with other people. And that's the one that I would, at certain points, have to come in and say, "Hey, you really need to tighten up and be more disciplined." And if I had given the counsel I would give to the one to the other, it would have
Yeah.
been,
It'd be
you
harmful.
know, it'd be harmful. It'd be a disaster.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that that was the kind of beginning part, and the part about risk too, like the different ways of building a
Hmm.
family felt like different levels of risk. One of the things that I liked that kind of came to mind in the later chapters, you talked about the call to love is a call to take risks. I know that's not the right quote, but it's kind of my takeaway of like it's
Yeah.
if we're going to love, it doesn't matter the method that the process of kids coming into our life. If we choose to love, the shadow side of that is entering into suffering, just like God is love and He suffers for us. Love and suffering kind of go together, and we don't talk about that all that much because we have maybe preconceived ideas about this is risky or this is what I can manage versus
Or this is what I deserve.
yeah, or I
Yeah.
deserve.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think that sometimes even when people do think about that, they think about it in terms of a prodigal child.
Uh,
And so you've got the risk that you might be hurt by a child who goes down a wrong path. Of course, that's true. There is, but what we don't tend to know is that there's great suffering that comes even in the best of circumstances,
Yeah.
because part of what it means to be a parent is to have this sense of, well, what about the perils that my child is going to face?
yeah.
And so sometimes I'll have to just remind myself. I'm thinking of, if we have a son who's going to be going off to college here in the fall, and both of us are like, oh, it's just good. It's so hard to imagine how unfamiliar it's going to be at first, and
Mhm.
realize, he's not worried about that.
Yeah.
And we weren't worried about that when we went through the same situation. It was, but having already been through it and knowing that, and then like thinking, how can I protect him through that?
Yeah.
And
Right.
that brings with it
I
its own
know
kind of
that
suffering.
struggle to protect our children from all the normal things of life. So what has, we really want to kind of ask you a lot of questions about your thoughts about the theology of adoption and the idea of all of us being adopted into the family, and that kind of thinking about that heart of God as you're talking about protecting your children. Where has your personal experience of parenting led you in that understanding of God's heart for us that way?
Well, I talked about in the book how what was revelatory to me was the way that I would face the same kinds of questions um, all the time. The questions that wouldn't have even phased me at any other time until I was in the middle of the process. So you would have people who would say something along the lines of, well, um, which ones are yours,
Mm,
and which ones are adopted? And I, I mean, I would just want to gouge my eyes out with a pencil. And I don't know why I'm talking about that as though it's past tense. I've had that conversation as recently as last week, where
uh,
I don't rebuke people for saying that, of course, but
yeah.
inside of it's just like, they're all mine. They're all ours, and they're all part of the family. It's just that there is a different way in, a different story, a different, all that matters,
Hmm.
but it doesn't matter in terms of who's in and who's out.
Yeah.
Right.
And so
I just have to
that
interject too, because with two adopted siblings from Vietnam, when we would walk around as a family, we had five children. I was one of five in 5 years. And the twins in the middle, who clearly, we looked different. So my mom encountered a lot of those types of questions, very,
yeah.
very intrusive and very rude questions that she developed some pretty snappy comebacks for. But it does, especially thinking about the children who are hearing those questions, it feels really kind of insulting to be asked, like, who belongs here and who doesn't?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also to the parents who are, um, the parents who are, it almost is like somebody is saying to you and your spouse, um, well, what about people who are in a real marriage?
Yes.
Right.
That kind of a thing. But, well, this is a real. I mean, what do you think real is? It's that sort of, and what really was revelatory to me is that my response internally, at least, to those kinds of questions revealed to me some bigger things
Mm.
about my own view
Hmm.
of what it means to be part of the church, a part of the household of God. When in reality, I mean, particularly, I mentioned this in the book, the question, because our sons that we adopted were 3 weeks apart, which we took them in. They had to have both of them had to have tubes in their ears early on, and we didn't even think about telling the story.
Mm.
And the person saw that they were 3 weeks apart in their birth dates, and he said, "I knew somebody who had this happen with twins one time." And
Oh
oh, no, no,
no,
no.
no.
And so when people would say, "Well, but are they brothers?" And what they really wanted to get at is, uh, are they biologically brothers? And the what bothered me so much is not that that's some part of their story that we're ashamed of, and it's not that there's not all kinds of contexts where that is necessary to be. I mean,
Hmm.
one of my sons went to a doctor's visit, and the doctor said, "Tell me your." This has not been that long ago. To tell me your family history when it comes to, and he says, "Well, I know my dad has high blood pressure, and my grandmother has a." And afterward, I said, "Did you tell him that you were adopted?" I
Yeah.
didn't even think of that. And so there are some contexts where that is necessary, but the reason it seemed to me that most people really wanted to find out that question is because there was an underlying assumption. Well, if they're biologically brothers, then at least they have each other,
Mm.
Yeah.
in a way that seemed to imply that everything else is less than real. And what I really grappled with in going through that is that's fundamentally exactly the question that's happening throughout the New Testament.
Hmm.
Um, Almost every adoption imagery and metaphor used in the New Testament is directly having to do with that question of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians coexisting together in the same body, both as children of God and both as heirs.
Yeah.
So it's not that God loves you all only. That's true, but it's also that you have the same standing within the family,
Hmm.
and that's easy to see why that would be such a difficult thing to imagine for everybody. I mean, if you're a Gentile who's become a Christian in first century Ephesus, and you go to the gathering and they're reading scriptures, and you realize everybody like me is the bad guy here, the
Hmm.
Goliath and so forth. That really needed to be reiterated. You're not here accidentally. I want you here, and you're not just sort of hanging on for the ride. If children, then heirs, and if
Yeah.
that's not clear enough for you, joint heirs with Christ. Uh, so that was something that I kind of had to work through quite a bit at the time.
Yeah, since I read that about the adoption and how you pulled that apart theologically, it's changed even kind of the donations to the church in Jerusalem, this kind of
Hmm.
looking as a whole body rather than one group doing things for the other group. And I think there's lessons for us today as we head into elections and all those type of things. The church is really, it still tends to fragment of in out I grew up in Western Michigan in a very conservative church, and we thought very few people would be in heaven, just that
Right.
denomination.
Yeah.
And
A lot of space.
yeah, but it's connected to that same kind of idea of what is full sonship, full heir and co-heir with Christ, and we don't live that out fully. I think that your theology of adoption really challenges that. It challenged my heart in that way.
Well, and it's not just in terms of, for lack of a better word, rights, but also in terms of responsibilities. I mean, the fact that Gentile churches are taking up an offering for the mother church in
Hmm.
one area of peril, sometimes there can be this sense of, well, you have the people who have the responsibility to care for everybody else, and that can bring with it a kind of pride and a kind of a sense of entitlement.
Yeah,
We're the real church, and so we're going to. And that's I had an African Christian say to me one time. He said the big problem we have in these cooperative endeavors is a lot of times the North American or Western European Christians assume that they are in charge because they have the money.
yeah,
Mm.
And so it brings with it this sense of, well, we're helping you,
yeah.
but we're really the church. So all that has to be, it takes a lifetime to,
Yeah, and
realize and take that apart.
this focus of we're all adopted, we're all entering in because of grace and how God loves us, frees us up to both respond our responsibilities, but also kind of the expectations come out of that. One of the stories you talked about that I would love to hear you speak a little bit more was Joseph, of looking at Joseph, Jesus's adopted dad, and how you kind of looked at that. What lessons did you learn as you looked at Joseph being the adoptive dad of Jesus, and how did that inform you?
Well, in several ways, but one of the ways directly has to do with what we were just talking about, and that's if you look at the genealogy of Jesus, look at the opening chapters of Matthew. Uh, there are, sometimes people. I even heard of someone preaching through a text and getting to a genealogy and saying yada yada yada. So,
Yeah.
and so, this part doesn't really matter. It's just but genealogies are really important in Scripture, and nowhere more important than in the genealogy of Jesus, because he's only qualified to be Christ if he's an offspring of David. That's the only ones who are qualified for the Davidic kingship. Only if he's of the offspring of Judah, and this is showing that through the line of Joseph.
Mm, mm,
So the same text is making it very clear Joseph contributes no DNA to the humanity of Jesus at all, but he is his father.
mm.
Hmm.
And if Joseph is not his father, none of us are saved.
Yeah,
Hmm.
That's how this happens. That's one part of it, but the other part of it is the way that Joseph embraces risk and vulnerability in obedience to God. I mean, I think we tend to kind of look over at Joseph because the Christmas kids pageant. He's the guy just standing there next to Will.
He's always just
Action
standing there
is
silently,
he's just
right?
standing there.
I
Yeah.
Yeah,
always thought that was the worst role to get in the Christmas
yeah,
pageant.
yeah, yeah. Maybe he gets to ask the innkeeper. Uh, but we think about that. But if you think about what's happening with
Hmm.
Joseph, I mean, first of all, it's not accidental that his in the providence of God that his name is Joseph.
Hmm.
When you have this repetition happening in Matthew, out of Egypt I've called my son, the angered king who wants to destroy the innocents. You have the one through whom that is being escaped through someone named Joseph, and you have somebody whose entire life trajectory was upended.
Yeah.
because I mean we know from the Gospels that there were all kinds of people saying, "Well, we're not children of adultery," implied the way you are. So
Right.
Joseph would have had to have lived with the shame, which in a first century context is beyond what we can even imagine now,
Yeah.
of having a betrothed wife, uh, or now full wife, who had cheated on him in the assumption of everybody else. He
Yeah.
he he throws that he goes to Egypt for an extended period of time. So he's throwing away his, for lack of a better word, career, and all out of obedience and care, and that was worth it,
Yeah.
you know. And
Yeah.
so I think that's really striking about this person.
Yeah, it's the whole family dynamic. So being, Tara's a doula, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and so I do think about the family relations, and even like James. So
Yeah.
thinking about your sons, right, and the
Hmm.
brothers' interaction, and we see that in Scripture too. We have Joseph the dad, we have James, in head of the Jerusalem church. That's Jesus's
Hmm.
brother.
Hmm.
And what must that have been like for him, and the full understanding of being fully a family, not just by blood, but by chosen
Yeah.
providence of God.
And you have to, one of those things that I wish that we had documented somewhere. I mean, we know that Jesus's brothers were not on board during the Gospels. They're when was this moment when the sort of normal family dynamics, even in the best of circumstances, I mean, I have great brothers and we love each other, and but you do have to remind yourself often that my brother's not 10,
Yeah.
anymore. He's just because we were in the treehouse together, sometimes you step back and say, "Oh wow, he's really an impressive grown up,"
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is obvious.
It's a
But you
full-grown
have to
guy.
remind yourself that as brothers, when's the moment when you realize, oh, my brother is the king of the universe,
Yeah.
and
That's a lot to take in.
I'm
it's a
not
lot to take in.
I'm not sure I would respond well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's remarkable, isn't
Right,
it?
but that genealogy it's really remarkable how much that means to the whole story. And I really hadn't thought about it in that way, that Joseph's standing through that family tree really was, it's the way it was meant to be. And there's a lot for us to learn in that ownership, that belonging, and so many other stories in Jesus's family tree that are surprising,
Hmm.
and that he teaches us a lot about love and belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's thinking about the one question I had from the book, and it's a
Hmm.
very important question of you mentioned wanting to go back with the family to the orphanage.
Hmm.
And I was wondering, have you made that trip? Did all seven of you go? Or I'm just curious about what that was like, because I know that was really about being called Abba Father and kind of not being stuck in the past and being able
Hmm.
to appreciate where we've been, but really our eyes forward of where we're going as inherited sons and daughters of Christ. Can you tell us about the trip to the orphanage?
Well, we couldn't,
Oh,
because I said we're going to wait until they're after 12,
yeah,
so that they're able to really understand what we're doing, and but by that point, I mean, I'm a very high profile critic of Vladimir Putin,
yeah,
and our a lot of our missionaries that we know in the former Soviet Union said you really shouldn't come now.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, and so I would say, yeah, let's just wait a little bit, and then
Things
you
haven't
know
gotten better.
things haven't gotten better,
No.
and then now they're the place where the orphanage is very close to the Ukrainian border,
Mm,
and so I don't think
Yeah,
I
That's
mean,
in the
I
cards.
don't see it happening anytime soon. And uh, to to be honest, that was always more of a priority for me than it was for them.
mm,
Yeah.
Um, I, I, I I really don't think they've ever given a second thought.
mm.
Even what we have done is to Google Earth. Okay, here's the town and here's the place, and they're going, That's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because for
What do we have to
you,
eat?
right, exactly.
Oh
It's
yeah, they're boys.
for you, it's so much more tied into those memories of when you met them and all of that, and it's not so much a part of their conscious
Yeah.
memories of joining your family. But we know that
Well, and one
you,
of the things that I knew is that, well, I don't know, but I suspect because it's the case with me. There are all kinds of things that I want to know about much later.
Mhm.
I lost my dad 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, and
Hmm.
there are all kinds of things where I'd say, "Man, I wish I had asked him this question because
Yeah,
he's the one who would know."
Yeah.
And so I thought, they might not really care about or want to go there right now, but there may be a time when they're 60
Yeah.
right.
when they suddenly think, "Oh man, I wish I had done that, or I wish I knew how to even get there," or
Right. Or maybe someday when they have their own children, those things come to
right.
light and are more significant. Yeah. And we know that you've built some traditions into your family to have that sense of belonging. And we loved that idea too. We were big into ritual and tradition and,
Hmm.
and that it's such a good bonding thing for a family to feel like, we always do this, or these are some things we do together as the Van Dyke family or the Moore family. So, can you
Hmm.
tell us something about those traditions that have kept you all feeling like the same unit and belonging and building things together?
Well, we have just our normal family traditions that we would have in any case, and then we have every year on the date that the adoption became legal, we call it More Day. Um, and what we try to do is to make that a day. It's not just about the two who were adopted. This was a really significant day for all of us in the family, and so it has to do with everybody. So we would often, I mean, it's not really feasible now that their lives have become so much more
Yeah. It gets more
so much
complicated, doesn't
it
it?
is more complicated. But for a long time, what we do is we would do something fun that day.
Mhm.
Um, and so we would go over to Chattanooga to Rock City or somewhere like that, do something fun that day. And also there's a food ritual aspect to it,
We love
which
food
is,
rituals. Yes.
yeah, be- because um, because we went to McDonald's that day
Mm.
at the end of that trip, even though it didn't
Not the
end
best
well.
memory.
But we try to go to McDonald's every more day,
Uh-huh.
and then for dinner, because uh, I am not a fan of Russian food, and that's just me. It's not
Yeah.
anything to say, but I was not a fan of much of the cuisine. And the place where we were staying, the lady who was preparing the food, I think she could tell that by the amount that I was eating until the day that she roasted a chicken that
Ah.
she had
Oh.
chickens out back and she roasted it. It was phenomenal.
Oh.
She just started making that roasted chicken
Because you
every
ate
day.
you ate it like
Oh
nobody's
yeah.
business. Yeah.
Yeah. So every night, every more day evening, we'll try to have roasted chicken and the kind of salad she made, and those sorts of things.
I love that because it can be passed on for generations. It's
Hmm.
kind of there's a similar tradition in our family that my parents built. My adopted siblings arrived on Christmas Eve, and they
Oh,
came from Vietnam. So we always have Vietnamese food on Christmas Eve. And that was my whole growing up. And now David's adopted that, and that's part of our
That's our
family tradition,
family.
even though it has to do with my siblings, but that's my family tradition. We're carrying on with our kids all expect it now too. Vietnamese food on Christmas Eve in honor of
And
my
Vietnamese food
siblings.
is a much better deal than
It's
It's
borscht.
better
it's
than Russian.
delicious.
Yeah, it's better than borscht. But it's a continuation. It's kind of a remembrance.
Yeah.
Similar, we have that in our faith. We have rituals that are remembrances to help anchor us. And our family life is important, but it's not the most important thing. The most
Right.
important thing is our anchoring in Christ. And as it's a reflection of that, I think, and it's just really neat to see that you guys have more day. I did have a question of how did you involve? So you involved your mother-in-law by giving her bad McDonald's. How else? How did you involve kind of the grandparents? Because I think of a couple that we interviewed a couple of weeks ago, and they really worked hard at dealing with the kind of change of expectation that grandparents and uncles and aunts have with family members being adopted. And are there rituals or involvement with them that you did to kind of help include understanding this is family? It might be a different process, but this is family. And how do we navigate that as an extended family?
We had some extended family members who were not very enthusiastic about the idea, but they were very extended. I mean, it was not
Mm.
anyone close in. Uh, and so for my parents and my brothers, there was no preparation needed. It was almost as though they had gone through some sort of seminar, which
Oh,
they hadn't.
Hmm.
Which and I think it might be the boys were the first grandchildren of my parents, and they just sort of immediately moved into grandparent mode, and there wasn't a I mean, they were there when we arrived home, and I can't think of a single thing that was different about the way that they responded then as when one of the other children would be born at the hospital. It was exact same sort of relationship.
mm.
And if anything, my dad and one of the sons that we adopted, really, really bonded. He had a close bond with all of my kids, but there was something really close there between the two of them. Um, and yeah, it was I really, of all the people I had to kind of let me explain this to you and get you caught up, they weren't
Oh, that's
Yeah.
so
they
good.
weren't one of them.
Family bonding is such a mysterious and magical thing, isn't it? You can't prescribe
Yeah.
it. It just there's some chemistry that happens. And we're just wondering, we probably are at the time where we need to start wrapping up. So just wanted to thinking you've displayed this through a lot of your personal story, but what do you think is the main kind of take home message for people, whether they're of faith or not of faith, about the heart of God through the picture of adoption and the things that you've learned?
Well, I think one of those things is that adoption is very, very difficult under the best of circumstances.
Mm.
There's always um, there's a trauma at the root of any adoption, no matter what, to varying degrees. So this isn't for everybody. It is something that is going to. You're not just taking a child and joining that child to your ongoing story. You're joining your story to that child
Hmm.
and to everything that comes with that child. And so I think people realizing that and knowing that
Mm.
at the very beginning is really important. But for the people who are called to do this, I think Jesus talked about how many of you, if your child, how many of you fathers, if your child asked you for bread, would give him a stone, and saying, if you're evil and you do this, how much more so in terms of the fatherhood of God?
Mm.
There's something that in a really broken, echoey kind of way shows you something about the fatherhood of God. And I think that the way that the way that a parent learns to say, just because you didn't come into the family the way that maybe I expected, um, doesn't change the way that you're my child.
Hmm.
Often can make you reflect on the fatherly love of God and Christ.
I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your life with us. It's been a special time.
Well, thank you. Thanks. It's been good to talk to you.
Yes, thanks so much for coming.